for our Good Friday. There's a story or a little parable to describe redemption, which has been passed on through the centuries. It appeared very early in Christian reflection on the meaning of redemption. And it's the story that God created the human, created Adam and Eve. Adam here is Adam and Eve. So anyway, he created them and he then sent them on a mission. And like a child, being thrilled to be given a job to do, responsible mission, Adam ran off as fast as he could without watching where he was going. And then he fell into a deep ditch. And it was so deep that he got caught in it and he couldn't get out. But then God sent a person, Jesus, to come and help Adam out of the ditch so that he could continue his journey, his mission, with a little more wisdom and prudence than he had shown before. And it's a very simple little parable, but the more I think about it, the more it takes us really to the heart of the meaning of this story of Easter, and the meaning in particular of the cross that we are reflecting on today. Let's listen to that story as it's told by St. Mark. In chapter 15, the passers-by hurled abuse at him. "Aha," they cried, wagging their heads. "You would pull the temple down, would you? And build it up in 3 days? So come down from the cross and save yourself." So too the chief priests and the doctors of the law jested with one another. "He saved others," they said, "but he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from his cross. If we see that, we shall believe." And even those who were crucified with him taunted him. At midday, darkness fell over the whole land, which lasted until 3 p.m. And at 3, Jesus cried out aloud, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So this very early account of the death of Jesus, which is taken up and developed by the other gospel writers, seems rather shocking to us. How could we imagine hurling abuse at a dying man? But it's not so much of an exaggeration. If we think of the cruelty of the games, the gladiators and the games of the wild beasts in the Colosseum, where the whole population of Rome, hundreds of thousands, would go to watch people, just for the fun of it, being pulled apart by wild beasts or killing each other for sport, and the crowd roaring their approval or disapproval. If we think of the death camps, the concentration camps, but not only the atrocities there, but even when the Jews were being rounded up in the villages of Eastern Europe, and the other villagers came out and watched it and jeered and laughed at them being taken away. Or we think of Srebrenica in Bosnia, where 8,000 boys and men just a few years ago were rounded up and massacred. So it's not so much of an exaggeration what we see in the description of the cross and the people's response to it, that man's inhumanity to man is horribly real, and it's not historical, it's recurrent. The cross is not an exception to this rule. It actually expresses what is happening continuously every day to innocent people. The cross today that we will venerate at the liturgy of the Passion highlights the cross that is always happening in our lives and in the lives of others. We think of abandoned and lonely old people being abused in their retirement homes. We think of children devastated for life by sexual or emotional abuse. We think of young, healthy people who are devastated by, handicapped by a motorbike accident, or who contract a fatal disease. Think of people, young people with disabilities, learning disabilities, who can't keep up with the others, but are sensitive to the rejection and the ridicule of others. We think of the grieving, those who have lost the most important person in their lives and who have no one to console them and nothing to replace that love with. We think of the victims of torture. We think of those we can name or those we can remember, but we also are aware of those whose names have never been recorded and who have been forgotten, that haven't had Amnesty or Human Rights Watch to keep their memory and their cause alive. The vast majority of human suffering, most of the crosses of our world are hidden. So the cross is not only the cross of Jesus. His cross, in the eyes of faith and to the heart open to its meaning, is like a magnet that pulls together, attracts in some strange way all human suffering to itself. It has a cosmic significance. In the book of Revelation, there's a mysterious phrase which speaks about the Lamb who was slain from the foundation of the world. So the idea here is that at the very foundation of the world, this suffering, this cross, was happening. It was already present from the very beginning. But also that it had some redemptive, some meaningful, some hope attached to it. The primal fault, or the flaw that we were talking about earlier, this original sin that all the spiritual traditions of humanity have in some way identified and reflected on. This is the blocking of a light, the blocking of the light of creation. And when that light is blocked, the darkness that is negatively created, it's not a positive creation like the world or light, but it's the privation of light. So when you put your hand over a source of light and block it. So darkness happens, is negatively created, and can become a force of its own. When we find ourselves in the dark, when we're doing something and the light goes out or the power breaks down, we're lost. We are incapacitated. And the first thing we do is look for light, for a match or for a candle or a flashlight. And this flow of darkness that we see in the inhumanity of man, in Srebrenica or in the camps or in the cruelty shown to children or old people, that in that flow of darkness we see what happens when we are deprived of the light. We see how we stumble around in our lives and in the world, angry and frightened and violent and lost. So the goal of light is enlightenment, to restore that source of life, the light of the world, and that's the only way that we can get rid of the darkness, not by fighting the dark or fighting in the dark, but by healing that flaw, that broken element that prevents the light from entering our world. And this is the meaning of the cross in any spiritual sense. And I think even for the non-Christian, the cross speaks from its silence, its stillness, its centrality, to this human condition. It speaks from that stillness with a great compassion. Not just pity. It's easy for us to pity all those victims of inhumanity I was describing. We can pity them. We'd be rather inhumane ourselves if we didn't feel any pity. But we have to move beyond pity or empathy even into compassion. And the word passion, the passion of Christ, the liturgy of the Passion that we are celebrating today, is well chosen to describe how we go through with, and Jesus goes through his own death and suffering with us. And that is compassion. It is the flowing together, the merging, the deepest sympathy between ourselves and others who are suffering. And when that happens, when that bridge of compassion is constructed across this lonely gulf of suffering, as part of the worst aspect of suffering of this kind is, of course, the utter isolation and loneliness. You see Jesus ridiculed and rejected on the cross in the ultimate loneliness of the human condition. And it's that loneliness which is perhaps the deepest suffering of all. So anything that bridges that gulf of loneliness is redemptive, is healing. It may not instantly stop the suffering, but it certainly changes and opens the heart of the people who are suffering. So the cross is not magic, although we're always looking for magic, so we try to turn lots of things into magic. But that isn't really how the cross works. The cross works at a real level of human consciousness, actually at the deepest level of human consciousness, where we are one, where the fundamental experiences of being human, of birth, of love, of suffering, of death, are shared. We intuitively, instinctively feel one at those crucial moments of meaning in our lives. So the cross stands, as it were, at the still point of the world, rather like the standing stone here on Bere Island, which we'll go to on Easter Sunday morning. And the cross stands at a center, just as the stone here is supposedly at the exact geographical center of the island. So the cross is at a historical center, not necessarily historical in the sense of how we measure time chronologically, but at the center of time in the sense that its influence works backwards and forwards. It is at an equal distance from the past, from the furthest reach of the past. So after this afternoon's celebration, we imagine Jesus descending deep into the dark places of history, into the pre-conscious and even into the pre-creation levels of reality, so that his influence, the influence that God desires to have in the creation he brings into existence, can be felt everywhere. That there is no dark corner left unvisited by the influence of the cross. So if we think of the cross simply as a way of, a knight on a white charger coming in and plucking us from danger and taking us away, or one of those messiahs that we elect periodically or think of as, or celebrities who we think will make everything better for us, we'll be disappointed, we'll miss the meaning of the cross. Nevertheless, the influence of the cross does change our lives, because there is nothing, because of the fact of its centrality and of its universality, that it is touched into the universal ground of human consciousness and human nature, it touches our DNA, if you like. There is nothing that can happen to us in our lives. The things we even fear to fear, the things we don't even want to think about, that we might just dream or have a nightmare about, that there is nothing that could happen to us where that influence, where that connection would not be felt, where we would not meet him. And that is the influence of the cross. Really, that is the redemptive power of the cross. Not a magic wand giving us in a phantasmic way what we want, but showing us in every aspect and corner of our experience our connection with the whole, with God. And this changes the way we live. And this, is, above all, is what the Easter story is about. It's about learning the meaning of the story so that it changes our story and our sense of the meaning of our own lives, and therefore helps us to live, to begin to live in a new way, to change our lifestyle, to change the patterns of fear or desire or obsession or self-rejection or cruelty that unconsciously very often become the traits of our characteristics of our personality, hidden or overt. So the cross stands at this still point of the world, and this universally with the spiritual geography, it's there at the center of the world. And historically, it is there at the center of time, equally distant from the beginning and the end, the future. And therefore it is redemptive. Therefore it makes a difference, not just a passing difference, not just changing our mood. We'll be in a certain mood today, of course. That mood will be different from the mood of the liturgy on Easter Saturday or Sunday morning. It's not just about changing your mood, though. It's about a more radical and permanent change. And for that to happen, the cross must be both at the center of humanity and at the center of the individual life. In other words, we have to respond to it personally, not just culturally, not just as part of a group. It has to be both personal and communal, and that will be expressed in the veneration of the cross that we will be invited to make during the liturgy this afternoon. We'll be there as a community, as a congregation, but each of us individually chooses to come up and venerate the cross in our own way. And it's this combination of the universal and the personal which makes the cross so mysterious. It's also why we can see how the cross dissolves karma. We've been speaking about the influence of this primal flaw or this original sin in the world. And the consequences of that and of our being influenced by it create karma. Karma simply means the consequences of the way we act. In a way, our karma, or the consequences of what we do, is often innocent in a way because we don't really understand the full consequences of the mistakes we make or the bad choices we opt for. We don't really understand how important they are. When you're having a fight with somebody, you're caught up in the anger and the passion of it, and you say things or you do things that have long and painful consequences, not only for you and the person you're arguing with, but anybody else standing around. And yet you don't realize that at the time. And maybe later you look back and you feel sadness, or guilt, or shame at what you did without knowing what you were doing. And that innocence really is what Jesus refers to in one of the Gospel accounts, where he asks the Father to forgive the people who are treating him like this, because they do not know what they are doing. And it takes a very enlightened and peaceful soul to be able to receive suffering from the hands of cruel people, cruel and stupid people, while understanding that they don't know what they're doing. But this may be the key to our own struggle with forgiveness. The cross is, among other things, the great symbol of the power of forgiveness. Not only of God's forgiveness of us, as we have been trained to think about it, but also of human forgiveness of other human beings and the faults that they have, the trespasses that they have committed against us. So the cross is this great statement that forgiveness is natural and possible and not out of reach, provided we wake up. You know, when you're struggling, and this might be something we could reflect on today in our quiet times, when we're struggling with a hurt that we have received from someone or others, when we're struggling with anger, with that sense of betrayal or memories of being unjustly treated, we're often thrown off center, we're often thrown into negative states of mind, we're often made to unwillingly to want to take revenge, to get our own back. We call it justice, of course, when we're talking about it. We want justice. That means we want the other person to suffer for what they've done. And so we are morally confused and agitated. And the only healing that can come to us in that doubly wounded state, because we're not only wounded by the person who hurt us, we're wounded by these negative and destructive emotions as well, anger and bitterness and violence. All that we can and must do to heal that is to see that no one would do this to another person if they knew what they were doing. And of course we say, well, yeah, but they did know what they were doing. They knew it well enough. But we have to get beyond that reactiveness, and we have to get to that deepest place of compassion and wisdom, which the cross represents. If anybody was entitled to feel a little peeved against other people who were hurting him, it would be Jesus at this moment. And quite clearly, he sees and what he knows is what allows him to invoke forgiveness. So the cross is a sign of a radical healing of the human condition, much more radical than we can imagine. But we experience that universality of the cross in our own lives, our own relationships, our own sense of self, if we are open to it at this level. And it's this that makes it possible for us to understand the language, symbolic language of the Gospels, the biblical language, which for most people today is a closed book and a meaningless code of jargon. But that expression, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, well, that actually says it in a certain symbolic formula, which today we have to explain. But that is what we mean by the taking away or the lifting or the dissolution of the karma, of the consequences of our actions. And this again happens both universally, cosmically, and personally. Any kind of suffering that is extended in time leads logically to death. And death, of course, seems to us as an end, as a finality, which therefore means that we fear it when we're looking after somebody who is dying, even if they're dying painfully. It's natural, at least for most of the time, to want to do everything to keep them alive, even if they're not able to interact or relate to you. The fact that they are there and alive, there's a certain fact in their being alive which which you want to maintain, because you know that at that moment of death, which is a moment, actual moment in time, your life is going to be completely different after that. So we don't like change, and we fear the loss of, especially of course, of those we love. So it's this very finality of death which challenges us to find meaning. If there is no meaning in it, if it doesn't give us meaning, then there is no meaning in life. In fact, it's all a dream, a rather mixed up kind of dream as well. So death has, as long as human beings have begun to think, and think about themselves, and think about more than about the next meal, then could you just ask death has become a source of meaning. The Neolithic tombs, there was a certain moment in social evolution, history of humanity, where we began to bury the dead rather than just throw them away like old Coke cans. And the burial of the dead, which of course is what ends the story in the episode of today, putting Jesus into the tomb, that is a sign that however final and empty and hopeless things seem, I haven't actually completely and totally given up some hope of finding meaning in what has happened, in what has been taken away from me. And this emergence in human consciousness of the meaning of death, or the hope that there would be meaning in death, that and therefore is expressed often in the idea of an afterlife. But I think the Christian story, as we are telling it in the Easter mysteries, is not so much, it cannot be reduced to that. In other words, it doesn't just say there is meaning in death because you will have life after death. It takes us to a deeper, that was certainly how our ancient ancestors first understood it. They would bury the dead with the things that the dead wanted to enjoy in the next life. In some cultures that meant putting their wives and children in there with them. But I think here, in this story now, we're moving to a much deeper level of understanding what the meaning of death is. And we have at least a day to think about it. Our attitude to death is a combination of cultural and psychological and personal factors. I was, I think, 25 about before I saw my first dead body, which in an Irish culture would be very late. And I think that's not uncommon. I've met people in England who would be much later, probably in the States as well. And there's in certain more fastidious cultures like that, there is not even so much a fear, I think it's a distaste. Death and the dead body is a rather embarrassing topic to confront. So we deal with it at a distance, keeping a distance from it, and often even not even talking about it very much. And that's a cultural and a personal phenomenon. But the way we do understand and approach and deal with death is crucial, I think, to our understanding the meaning of this story. We don't forget the physicality of the story, the taking of Jesus down from the dead, his dead body, and then just at that moment where the story explodes into light, we're told about the women coming to the tomb to anoint the body for the final stages of burial. So the body, although it is dead, is still present, is still part of the lives of those who have been left behind. So I think we need to examine our own attitudes to death as we contemplate the death of Jesus, and even that gesture today of venerating the cross is a physical encounter with something that, for many people or many cultures, we want to avoid. Medically, death is not interesting. Death is a failure. It's the failure of medical science. Doctors and medical practitioners often feel exhausted or ashamed even when their gifts and their instruments are not able to bring somebody back to life or keep them alive. So shame does have this, death does have this tendency for all of us, I think, to touch us with a feeling of failure, a shame, or illogical, but nevertheless can be emotionally quite strong. It can also push us into a sense of panic, because it is a radical, perhaps the radical loss that we experience in life. When you lose your keys or your passport, we often overreact. We often feel a real panic rising in us, perhaps because every loss we experience, even a minor one like that, triggers our fear of loss, our fear of death, or the emotional losses, or other ways in which we have lost what is precious to us in the past. So death opens up for us a great deal of self-knowledge, if we allow it to be a teacher to us. And that's how, spiritually, I think we have to see death as a teacher, not as an enemy, not as a shame, and not to prejudge it. We can never really discover the meaning of death until we've discovered it, until we've experienced it, until that moment of revelation or breakthrough happens. Let's just look finally at a section from the Gospel of Luke, which also about the resurrection, and then we'll meditate. I think it's Luke. There were two others with him, criminals who were being led away to execution. And when they reached the place called the Skull, Golgotha, they crucified him there, and the criminals with him, one on his right and the other on his left. Think of the duality we've been speaking about. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing." They divided his clothes among them by casting lots. The people stood there looking on, and their rulers jeered at him. He saved others. Now let him save himself, if this is God's anointed, his chosen. The soldiers joined in the mockery and came forward offering him their sour wine. If you are the king of the Jews, they said, save yourself. There was an inscription above his head which ran, this is the king of the Jews. So everything has been inverted. That's what a nightmare is. Everything has been turned around into a negation of its true meaning. One of the criminals who hung there with him taunted him. Are not you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other answered sharply, have you no fear of God? You are under the same sentence as he. For us it is plain justice. We are paying the price for our misdeeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. So this is the crucial thing here. How do we respond to it? The thief who just joins in with the mockery, the negation, the bitterness. I mean, the sour wine is a symbol of the bitterness that suffering can make us feel. The hatred, the bitterness, the violence, the self-destructiveness, the overturning of all the hopes of our lives can produce terrible despair. And that despair reflects itself in a rejection, a personal bitterness. We become an embittered personality and go around trying to embitter everybody else. So that's one option. The other option, whether this is the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere, it doesn't say which side he was on. The other good thief says, have you no fear of God? The fear of God here the fear of God always in biblical terms means a sense of wonder, a sense of respect or reverence for God, a sense of the numinous or the mysterious presence of God. So he's not saying, he's hardly saying, God's going to strike you down if you speak like that. He's already been struck down. So it's why. In other words, why have you lost this sense of wonder? How have you lost it? You are under the same sentence as he. And here is this beautiful, gentle rationality of the gospel story. Although it's so full of symbolism and mystery, there is this note of reasonableness about it too. We see it in the way Jesus responds to the soldier who hit him during his interrogation. And he says, why do you strike me? If I've said something wrong, point it out to me. Otherwise, why do you strike me? It's that simple, rational explanation for non-violence. So again, we see that in the good thief here. He sees the difference between them. And he sees the innocence of Jesus. And it's the innocence of Jesus, of course, as I was saying yesterday, that gives us the key to understand what the cross is changing. It's changing the programmed, or the programs, the way we are pre-programmed for violence. Because if we really understand the innocence of Jesus in this situation and his response to the injustice which he's suffering, then we are set free from that cultural programming which itself grew out of this primal flaw, this primal sin. this man has done nothing wrong. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come to your throne. Well, that seems to be taking him to another level, to a higher level of faith vision. He's not only saying he's addressing the other thief, what you're saying is wrong. He's now turned towards Jesus and sees something that perhaps he didn't see until that moment. What Jesus means by the kingdom. And Jesus replies, I tell you this, today you shall be with me in paradise. So let's meditate now. Take a couple of moments, if you like, to stretch and